cutting up some material today. I've had this tree and a couple of other pieces sitting out for a better part of a year now. I got the hurricane about to come over the top of us, and it's been sitting out in the weather a little bit too long, so I don't want it to dump another 4 or 5 inches of rain on it. Most of this material's been spalting for a pretty good while now, and you know, I'm at risk of letting it go too far and it's not really going to be usable. So I'm here cutting up my material and wanted to talk about what I see in spalting, what I'm looking for when I cut things up. This is a really good example of what you can get out of your trees that aren't typical log sections. You'd think if you're going to turn a bowl, you're pretty much looking at it out of the trunk section of a tree. You want to cut out the pith, which in this case is running right about here, so that doesn't leave you a whole lot of material either side to do much of the way bulwark wise. It's part of the reason why I end up making a lot of vessels, because I can take a section like this, which is one of the upper limbs of this tree, and I don't think this was a really big tree to begin with, but I can get a pretty good sized vessel out of this. So, you know, that's probably 8, 9, 10 inches right there. So I can get a pretty good hollow form out of that on a sculptural piece, particularly if it's been spalted a lot. The pith isn't as big of an issue. If it's been down, a lot of the moisture is kind of already out of it, you're not going to get a whole lot of distortion at this point after it's turned. And we're in North Carolina here. You can pretty much take a tree and let it sit out and do nothing with it, come back in about a year or so, and you'll get a lot of this patterning, a lot of the zone lines. You get some orange and red staining, a lot of blue staining. Blue staining is very common up here. Pretty much any maple that you leave out is going to get blue stain, you know, within a matter of months or so. So this is another piece here. This tree section I saw was all hollow. This is a piece of maple, and a lot of times you can see this. It's real typical on the outside of the tree. You'll get sort of this fiddleback pattern, and you know, you might think, well, this tree's got a big hollow in it. This doesn't leave me a whole lot left here. But I can section out pieces, blanks, make small hollows, urns, as long as there's not a whole lot of voids and wormholes and things like that. And I'll even take sections that are somewhat questionable, because I think I might be able to get an ingrained hollow out of this, because I think there's enough solid material, and you know, if it works out, you get a lot of this nice patterning in here. So this is pretty typical of how I cut things. These two pieces right here are a piece of pecan, and when I go out and I gather and I cut, I'll oftentimes, even if I'm doing hollows, I will butt the tree into sections. So you make your cut here and here out of your whole trunk. This came out of a trunk section, and I cut the pith out. So this is basically half of the trunk of the tree, and I'll get truckloads of it at a time, and I'll go out and just dump it and let it sit. And this has been sitting for on the ground about a year or so, and like I was saying earlier, this is still pretty intact. So I mean, it could hold out for quite a while. But this is another section I already cut up, same tree, and we're starting to get the spalting in here and changing the color. This is the heartwood right here, the pecan, and some of this is the normal color, but you're starting to get some of these streaks in here from the spalting pattern. So I want to talk about what I'm looking for in these. In general, if I'm cutting blocks for doing hollows, I'm looking at just kind of a block or a chunk that's roughly rectangular, square. A lot of it's going to depend on what the tree gives you, what you're able to work with in a situation like this, where most of the tree was basically intact. I can cut large sections and then come back later and chop off what I see, what looks good to me. So lately, I've been trying to turn vessels that have more height, and if I'm going to do a face grain turning, I'm going to mount the hollowing point's going to go in up through here. So I'm trying to get more height out of this section. If I want a really tall one, I might do an end grain turning, which means I'll be on the end, and I'm roughly just squaring this out so I can mount it on the lathe. So I've already cut this one up, and I basically did just that. So I've got some options either way, depending on what this is going to be. I can do an end grain coming through the end, or a face grain coming up through here and keep the natural edge. A lot of that's going to depend on if I'm going to do a sculptural piece. In this particular one, I've got some nice colors in here. I've got a lot of small pin wormholes right there, so this will probably be a sculptural piece, because I try to avoid a lot of filling of these types of wormholes and things like that if I'm trying to make a sealed vessel. It can be done, but you put a lot of labor into it. So from here, I'm kind of wanting the spalting to stop, which means you're going to need to get a lot of the moisture out of it. So it's time to bring it inside and get it out of the rain. I'm not too worried about this. These were sealed originally. He's starting to have some checking in the ends. Now, this won't go too deep, at least on this species. So I'm not too worried about re-waxing after I cut it. You're not going to get a whole lot of evaporation out of the sides. This is a section of maple I found, and this is what came out of it. This was one of the original test pieces to see what the wood looked like. This was real common in this tree. This was lower to the base of the tree, had fallen over. This was the heart section, the pith had already started to rot away. A lot of the sections higher up in the tree, they were all hollow. It was a pretty big tree, but for bulwark, that's just something nobody looks at. But it's hard to discard something like this when you can go and you can see a lot of this figure up in here. Some of the spalting already starting to happen. We get ambrosia very, very frequently in just about every maple. There's always some. So some of that's probably going on. Looks like there's a little bit right here. And it's probably why I make more vessels than I do bowls now, because I frequently come across this material that would be considered defective, and it's certainly not great for bowls in terms of having cracks or voids and utility pieces and that sort of thing. But you can kind of get some indications of this when you're out in the woods, or you see a tree laying down, of some of these features that are already starting to come. And what I will do on this one is, I don't have a whole lot of material up here size-wise, so if I'm considering making a hollow out of this, I've either got to do a small hollow if I'm doing a face grain that's coming up here, or if I'm doing end grain, I've got more depth to play with, but it's going to be probably a taller piece. So I like to if I can get away with it, I like to keep sections in as large a section as possible until I'm really ready to turn it. Because if I section out into smaller pieces like this, frequently by the time I get around to them, they may have already started to check up some more and crack, and they may not be usable at this point. So you get more life out of your tree if you can if you have space to keep it in this bigger section. So I'm back here. This was a full section that I just made the first cut in, and like I was saying earlier, I like to keep the tree in the full section till I'm ready to cut it. So I wanted to see what this one was doing, and want to talk about what I will probably do here. I don't see, this is me poking in here to see how punky it was. This is still pretty solid. That can hold a tenon pretty well. So I have flexibility on this piece to do sealed vessels or hollow vessels. I like a lot of the contours up here. That gives me opportunity to incorporate some voids in the piece. The spalting pattern in this is spectacular, so this will probably be a hollow. I'll probably cut this again, probably in half, and do a hollow that is full size, and do a coming probably out here on the face grain. And I'm not too worried about keeping the pith on this one. I typically don't like to do end grain turnings with the pith in, because usually that'll mean the pith is right at the very bottom, and I've done some of them that way. They almost always seem to distort a little bit, and the turning's a little bit trickier, the hollowing, because your grains kind of go in all different directions, even on end grain. So most of these I'll probably do face grain, but even on a limb section like this isn't too big, but I'll probably get 3 hollows out of this, maybe 2 here. If I wanted to do full size, if I wanted to cut the pith out, I'd cut that, get some sections on either side of it. And one of the other things I want to mention that I noticed, this was where a branch came out, and I've noticed this a lot on crotches and branches, is that they will typically spalt a lot faster than other areas of the tree. So a lot of times I'll turn crotch sections of trees because I know they have figure. They will probably start to spalt a little bit in there, and everybody loves to get rid of crotch sections because they don't split for firewood very easily. So that's generally not a problem to get a hold of. I read an article in the American Wood Journal recently. They were talking about defective wood, and kind of want to challenge the concept here, because most everything I turn is probably would be considered defective wood. And I don't know how much people, when they see the outside of a tree, they see fungus growing all over it, if they would even really think, or even if they see sections here that that's starting to look rotten, and what can I do with that? I don't, they like it. Look at this end grain. You think it's probably cracked, and they got growth going all over it and everything, and yet on the inside you get a lot of those patternings. And so you would be surprised about how suitable a lot of this material is, particularly if you're going to go and cut a lot of it yourself. And one thing, if you're just kind of scouting out, poke the outside. The outside's going to deteriorate most likely the quickest. So if the outside is still a little bit solid, and you see all these insects crawling over it, and fungi growth and everything, you're starting to see some of these discolorations, some of these yellow molds in there. All right, so got this section here. I'm about to cut it. I just removed the bark, and this is piece of that pecan section I was talking about. And what I'm looking at, I'll show you one of the things I'm looking at when I'm deciding where am I going to make my cut, what am I going to try to get out of this. So right now I'm looking to turn a lot more sealed vessel bodies right here. So this one is a piece of walnut, and I'll hold it on my side here. This is about 220, 230 cubic inches, something like that. And I prefer to do face grain turning if I can get away with it. So what I'm looking at right here is I'm looking for a section, if I'm going to do something like this, that the first thought I have is to kind of make a section cut right here. That gives me enough room height-wise in this dimension, or I could go crossways, come out of here, or come in on the side. Now, all of this assumes that, you know, the material is good to use, but you don't ever really know that for sure. In some cases, looks like I got a little bit of a branch pith here, and there's another one here, so this may have been a crotch starting to form right there, but it looks like it's near the base, so I don't expect those are going to go very deep. So either way, I think I have enough material to get something this size out of right there. So one of the things I thought was interesting, I'll take a look at the bark, I don't know how well it's going to show up. You have this kind of gash right here. So a lot of times when you see that in the outside of the tree, that might be an indication that you got an old fence line or something like that. And you can kind of see where this is bulged out a little bit and kind of growth up around. So, and this is about where I'm looking to make a cut. So there might be a bunch of metal right in here. Won't know until we get into it. Sometimes they're just, particularly on pecan, sometimes it's just lines of woodpecker borings around the edge outside, or which you can sort of see some of that right here. It pokes right there in various spots. Or it could be a piece of cable, particularly if you're harvesting material that was on farmsteads, fence lines, things like that. So we'll see. So my plan is I'll make a cut here, and this will leave me a section right here that I can do some smaller work out of. I might get 2 vessels out of that, I might get 1 big one, but usually I'm looking at this and I'm seeing at least 2 vessels, maybe 3, and we'll just see what we get. A lot of this is you make a cut based on what you think you can get out of it, and you just kind of roll with it and see what you can work of after you open it up and see what you're dealing with. All right, this is what we got. No metal, so we're good there. Looks like we got a little bit of a, you know, a defect, or maybe possibly a branch starting. You got some figure kind of going on in here. This is a good example of what I was talking about, the outside of the tree. So the spalting is going to come in on the outside edge of the tree first, and then it's going to start to penetrate in. So you see that a lot, particularly on denser hardwoods, things like poplars, soft maples, softer hardwoods, that sort of thing. They're going to spalt a lot quicker. You can afford to leave something like this out in the elements a bit longer. And we got some nice grain going here. Here's the pith of the tree. Some of these original growth sections here, starting to get some spalting zone lines up here. So I think a lot of this material is going to be really intact and suitable for a sealed vessel. Don't see a whole lot of wormholes in there, and you can get some of this patterning here. On a section like this, these are some of the first ones that I brought back, and these were the ones that were on the ground. You can see sitting on the ground right there, a lot of the vegetation starting to grow into it. I could probably leave this for another 6 months or so, and it might pick up more zone lines. You get more patterns. It's just going to depend on what you want to do with it. If you need something really solid, or If you're going to do something sculptural, you could probably let this go. Decorative stuff, you got a lot more flexibility, and just let this stuff do what it's going to do. Some areas, parts of the country, the world that are very dry, probably not going to get a whole lot of spalting. You can try some of these other tricks to, soak them in bags, let them sit, try to spalt your wood that way. I'm pretty lucky out here that we don't really have to try very hard to do any of that. We get lots of humidity, lots of moisture, and this stuff just goes on its own and does its magic.